Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Antonio Gervasoni and I'm a Peruvian classical music composer and university professor. I've been following the development of MuseScore since its first version, many years ago. It's not the main program I use to write music, I'll explain why in this video, but from time to time I create a score with it just for fun, and also to see the latest improvements. In recent years, MuseScore has made great strides forward. When I started composing, back in 1998, I worked with a program called Encore, which is apparently still in use, or at least it was about 5 years ago. Comparing MuseScore to that program, the version I used in 1998 of course, would be like comparing a horse carriage to a Ferrari. I wish I had a program such as MuseScore in those days. It's amazing what the MuseScore team has accomplished so far, and I hope they continue to develop it further. When version 3.5 came out, I thought it would be an interesting challenge to transcribe a complete orchestral score with it. I wanted to test not only its ability to create a properly notated score, but also to produce a convincing and decent audio playback. I wanted to answer a simple question: could a serious music composer or editor work with MuseScore? So my first task was to choose a score. I needed a well-known piece, not only because that would make it easier for me to spot errors, but also because it would mean that more people would be able to verify the accuracy of both the notation and the playback. Therefore, I chose Rimsky-Korsakov's Sheherazade, which I have listened to countless times since I was little, and set myself the task of creating a MuseScore file of its first movement, a piece of music that I could almost transcribe by ear. Naturally, this also meant that I wouldn't be testing MuseScore's ability to create modern classical music scores, and especially avant-garde music. But I thought it was fine since most people don't write that kind of music after all. Of the scores available at IMSLP, I chose Music's 1931 reprint of the 1915 Eulenburg print, which I found to be the most legible. However, during the transcription process I discovered some inconsistencies in the score, so I decided to take on the role of an editor, and not just that of a mere transcriber, and made some decisions about changes in layout, notation conventions, and even the omission of some indications that I thought were errors or the inclusion of others that to me had been mistakenly left out. This video is not about how to use MuseScore. For that, there are already many videos available on YouTube. My purpose is to show you what MuseScore can do. However, I'll quickly mention some functions and how they work whenever I deem it necessary. I'll also show you several examples from my transcription and briefly discuss how I achieved them, and thus try to answer the question I mentioned earlier. That is MuseScore good enough to be used as a program for serious musical work? I also have to mention that, for the most part, I've left the automatic result of MuseScore intact. In other words, I've refrained from adjusting the position of objects in the score to my personal taste, except when those objects, in my opinion, were placed incorrectly, or when I thought that the position or appearance of those objects would create problems in the final layout of the score. Finally, while I was still working on my transcription, version 3.6 came out, and boy, it really is a game changer. My work was able to benefit from the latest enhancements to the program, especially the new fonts, which I think are amazing. Now let's move on to the examples. I should start by mentioning that MuseScore has a collision detection algorithm that works quite well most of the time. Objects and staves are automatically separated when a collision is detected, and 99% of the time, you don't have to do anything. This is a feature that Sibelius and Finale users had to look forward to for many years, and was achieved very quickly by the MuseScore team, from version 2 to 3 if I'm correct. At first it had its problems, but now it works really well. Starting with the first couple of pages, you'll notice that MuseScore is capable of creating what is typically known as a French score, that is, a score in which no empty staves are printed, thus reducing the number of pages needed. This is done in the Score tab of the Style window. The second checkbox will also force MuseScore to display brackets when there is only one instrument left in a group. This is the way I like my scores, so I always put a check on it. Unfortunately, this also applies to the sub-brackets, as you can see here in the cello. Later in the piece, a solo cello part appears, and I use a sub-bracket, as in the original score, to visually maintain the correlation between the soloist and the other players. In my opinion, the checkbox should only affect the brackets and not the sub-brackets, but, well, this doesn't look too bad anyway, and I prefer to have individual staves with a bracket more than I want this sub-bracket to disappear. MuseScore can also switch from group playback to solo on a string part. This is not just a text, it's an instrument change. To create one, a text message is used, which you can find in the text palette. In this case, MuseScore automatically creates a 2-violin indication, but this is not how this type of change should be notated. The correct indication should be something like first solo, and can be easily corrected by simply double-clicking and typing the appropriate text. Then, when you need to get back to the group sound, just create another instrument change, but be sure to select the All Instruments option and then look for Violins with an S. Now the only thing left is to change the text to the usual tutti. It goes without saying that the instrument change function works with other instruments as well, but there are no other instrument changes in this score. After a program change, you can also change the name of the instrument displayed to the left of the staff. For the above case, the correct way to indicate a solo violin is with a dash followed by an S after the short name. Having changed to tutti, you can now go back to the usual short name, and this doesn't alter the change in the solo passage. One thing that has yet to be implemented is the ability to create system texts such as tempi elsewhere in the score. You can only make them appear above or below the system, not in both positions at the same time, and certainly not anywhere else. In symphonic scores, it is common to repeat the system text above the strings. You can use a staff text to create a fake system text, but if this happens frequently, it could be a tiring job, especially since you would have to align each of them manually. Arco and pizzicato indications are already set and play right out of the box. You can also enter techniques that are not included in the palette and define the timbre that should sound when they appear, but I won't explain here how to do that, and I imagine that is limited to the available sounds in MuseScore. Some of the improvements made in version 3.6 are changes that I've wanted to see for a long time. The new text and music fonts are just gorgeous, and scores now look very professional right away, which in my opinion was not the case before. Also, finally the page numbers are by default at the top, slurs and ties are thicker in the center, which makes them look much better, and staves can now be justified vertically. Congratulations to Martin Kiri, aka Tantacruel, chief designer at MuseScore, for these improvements. And speaking of page numbers, you can also include a heading text that appears on each page with, for example, the name of the composer and the name of the piece. The only problem is that both the page numbers and the text in this header are part of the same text style called header. I like to have medium-sized page numbers, but I prefer the header text to be smaller than them, and under this scheme I can't get both. I hope that in the future they will create separate styles for each type of text. You can also create crescendo and diminuendo lines that look and play back correctly. You can even adjust certain parameters of those lines, such as the thickness and length of the dashes, and you can also hide the line and continuation text. Pretty neat, huh? In general, MuseScore places the slurs correctly, but sometimes they look a bit strange, like this one. This other slur has been unnecessarily placed too far from the notes. You can change their position, but you have to do it one slur at a time. There are global variables you can adjust, but as you can see here, they are very few, and none of them corrects the behavior I just mentioned. Ties are also positioned correctly, except in some cases involving dotted notes, like this example. The tie should not collide with a dot, but there is no global variable to correct for this behavior. Half a space up is all that is needed. This is not exactly the way it should be handled, but it works. However, again, you have to do it one at a time. MuseScore can also create system separators, but in the past, I've had problems with them while working on a score, so I always put them at the end, when the score is finished, thus preventing them from appearing in the wrong places as they sometimes do. The program also aligns consecutive dynamics, although, as you can see in this example from another score, this doesn't work correctly all the time. Fortunately, you can easily select multiple items of the same type, and in this case, if you just move the hairpins, the expression text will move along with them. This is something you will also have to do if you enter natural harmonic signs. Unfortunately, MuseScore places them too far from the note heads, and there is no global parameter that affects their position. In symphonic scores, French horns generally don't have a key signature, and this can be done quite easily by simply holding down the Control key or Command key on a Mac and dragging from the palette the one that looks like a gray X to the specific staff where you want the signature to disappear. However, you must do this for every key signature change in the score. One thing that I forgot to mention about French scores in MuseScore is that you can mark certain staves so that they are not affected by the checkbox in the Styles window. This is why, in my transcription of Sheherazade, the string staves are never hidden, a feature of most French scores, with the exception of course of the solo parts. Sometimes tuplet numbers collide with the slurs, and you have to manually push them away. This happens when the number is placed above the slur rather than below it. Also, in this other case, the slur has been moved up to avoid colliding with the flat sign, but this is not the way this particular event should be handled. Crossing them is the norm, and if you don't believe me, check out Quotes Behind Bars or take a look at professional music editions. This is a page I'm not very proud of, and I'm sure professional editors will flog me for allowing this to happen, but I wasn't trying to produce a professional edition of the score anyway. What I want to show you here is that I had to insert a vertical frame to prevent MuseScore from spreading the staves too far apart, which I think looks even worse, so if you encounter a problem like this, just insert a vertical frame. This is an interesting example, 3 voices on one staff. Not easy to achieve, but MuseScore can handle it pretty well, as you can see. Sometimes you do have to manually separate some staves, as in this example. In this case, I had to do it because MuseScore doesn't detect a collision between the lower staff of the horns and the accidental above the trill line. For this, you must use a spacer, which you can find in the Breaks and Spacers palette. I don't think there are any other things that I need to mention about the score. You can judge the result for yourself. The link is in the description below. I was able to recreate each sign and indication of Rimsky-Korsakov's work. For all intents and purposes, I believe that MuseScore is capable of producing a good and accurate score, at least for a piece written in traditional notation. So now we come to the answer to my question. Could a serious music composer or editor work with MuseScore? Well, that depends. And to explain why I say that, let me show you an example of how I had to do something in MuseScore to make it appear as it does in the final score. You may have noticed that this piece has an abundance of trills. Trills have been a common type of ornament in classical music for centuries, although their appeal has almost disappeared in the last 100 years or so. But even so, this piece has far too large a number of them for a work of its time. Entering trills is not a difficult task in MuseScore. Simply select the affected note or notes and select a trill line from the lines palette. However, sometimes trills need an accidental on top, because the other note involved is not defined in the key signature. This can easily be done in MuseScore. Just select the trill, go to the appropriate palette, click the accidental and... Hey! What happened? Why am I on the first page of the score? Well, you just witnessed a MuseScore bug. No, not that kind of bug. A software bug. Every time you add an accidental to a trill, MuseScore jumps to the first page of the score. This can be avoided if you enter the trill in continuous view. But if you forget to switch to that view before doing so, boom! You end up on the first page and have to find your way back to where the trill is. Well, it's no big deal. It was the last measure, so I just have to hit the end button on my keyboard and locate the trill, and... Hey, where's the accidental? Well, now you're looking at another one of those bugs. Just move the trill up or down a little, and the accidental will magically appear. And there it is. Now, what if you don't like where the accidental is placed? In my case, for example, I prefer them to be a little further to the right. There should be some preference in MuseScore where I can adjust that, right? Well, no, I'm afraid not. It can be argued that the automatic placement isn't that bad after all, and I should be able to live with what MuseScore offers me if it's scored correctly. But what if this was a job for some client, and that client asks me to move all the accidentals a little more to the right? Well, in that case, the only option left for me is to do it on a case-by-case basis. I already showed you that you can select multiple items of the same type in MuseScore. However, this doesn't work with accidentals attached to trill lines. You have to do it one by one, and in a score with so many of them, it's a very time-consuming task. Now imagine that your client thinks you moved them a little too far to the right and asks you to fix it. Here I think the trill line is a little too far from the slur. Oh well, that's fine. I just have to move the trill line a little more. Hey, what now? Why did the trill line move all the way down? What happened to the collision detection algorithm? Have you already guessed it? Yep, it's another one of those nasty bugs again. Now, trills aren't used as much today, and don't get me wrong, it's not that all other elements in MuseScore have a bug. No. Also, to be fair, all programs have bugs, and in a free program maintained by volunteers, I think it's normal to assume that you may be able to find a little more than usual. After all, it's free, right? And for a free program, I have to admit that it is exceptionally good and stable. But this is where I come back to the answer to my question. In my opinion, if you're a serious music composer or editor, I do think that you can use MuseScore. But if time is a limitation for you, then I think you could benefit more from a program that gives you tons of global parameters, so you can tweak the position of each tiny element in the score at once to your heart's content, instead of having to do it one by one. That is why I said at the beginning that MuseScore is not the main program that I use to write music. You see, I teach at 3 universities, and I even have a few private students, so I have little time to compose and even less to enjoy with my family or just relax. I need a program that will free me up as much time as possible, and MuseScore is simply not able to do it at the moment, although it might be the case in the future. The team has already announced that they are working on version 4, and who knows, maybe that version will include a lot of global parameters. I hope it does. But if time is not a limitation for you, if you're a student, a music aficionado, or if you're a serious composer or editor who just has a lot of spare time, then of course go for MuseScore. It's a wonderful program, and as you can see, it can definitely get the job done, and pretty well, I must say. Nevertheless, I have to give you one final warning. When you open a score created in a previous version, things can sometimes appear out of place. Just take a look at this picture. On the left, what the page looked like in version 3.5, and on the right, what it looks like now in version 3.6, just one version apart. This happens with most programs, true, but I'd say it happens a little more with MuseScore. However, there is something you can do to avoid it if you work on Linux or Mac. In those systems, you can install new versions of MuseScore without having to uninstall the old ones. In this way, you can open old files in the version in which they were created. You can include this information in the file name, but it is also in the file's properties. Of course, at some point the operating system will no longer be able to run older versions. But this is true for all other programs as well. Nothing is forever, right? So this concludes my assessment of MuseScore's ability to create professional musical scores. Thank you for watching. Hope you liked this video, and be sure to check out the score at musescore.com. I've also uploaded an animation of the score to my YouTube channel, where you can hear what the playback sounds like in MuseScore. Very decent for free software if you ask me. Kudos to Christian Collins for that. The link is in the description below.